3, 2, 1.
Good morning. On behalf of our president, Jack Marin, and our executive director, Stephen Aquario, I want to thank you for joining NYSAC this morning for a webinar on the 2020 census and the status of redistricting. As the Census Bureau finalizes the 2020 population counts, the state of New York and counties prepare to redraw the political boundaries for the next 10 years of congressional seats, assembly and senate districts, and county legislative districts. Counties with boards of supervisors will also consider if and how they will have to change their weighted voting systems, all depending on if and how populations have changed and shifted in communities across the state over the last 10 years. This webinar has been designed to provide a status report with where we are in those two interrelated processes. We are joined this morning by two distinguished presenters, and I will introduce them to you in just a moment. First, I would like to thank PERMA for sponsoring this morning's webinar workshop. PERMA, the Public Employer Risk Management Association, is the largest and most successful self-insurance pool for public entities in New York State. They have been providing workers' compensation benefits for over 35 years to more than 550 municipalities who have chosen PERMA to manage their claims and ensure workplace health and safety. Thank you, PERMA and Leah Demo, for helping us put on this 2021 virtual legislative conference for NYSAC members. This morning, all attendees will be on mute. If you have a question, please submit it in the chat area of the webinar panel on the right side of your screen. After the panelists have done their presentations, we will take up all the questions we receive. Again, thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning, and thank you to our two distinguished panelists, which I will introduce to you now. Our first, Mark, yes.
Mark, we do just have one other item. I apologize for butting in. We do have a video from our sponsor, PERMA, that I'd like to run if that's okay. It just takes a couple of minutes, but because our sponsors are so important to us, I just wanted to make sure that we played it.
Thank you.
Good morning, and on behalf of PERMA, welcome to the New York State Association of Counties 2021 Legislative Conference Session. Today, I'm speaking to you on behalf of PERMA, the Public Employer Risk Management Association, where I serve as chairman of the board of directors. If you are not aware, NYSAC is a partner with PERMA, and I have the pleasure of serving on the PERMA board with your executive director, Steve Aquario. 2020 was indeed a unique year for challenges for local governments. Like never before, we have had to use our creativity and resourcefulness to continue municipal services and protect our employees in an operating environment foreign to most of us. I'd like to fill you in on some of the initiatives that PERMA rolled out in short order this past year to assist our members during the pandemic. First, we continue to provide subsidized personal protective equipment for all members at 50% of market cost. We initiated a return of member equity program, which allocated $2 million of PERMA's surplus distributed directly to members in order to assist with financial challenges brought on by the pandemic. In addition to the equity return program, we offer members the option of a 3% reduction in their renewal contribution in exchange for a 45-day notice that they agree to remain a member of PERMA. PERMA has also rolled out a completely virtual platform for all training and educational programs and introduced several new risk management offerings for COVID-related relief. We have provided policy manuals and protocols to help our members safely reopen the wide variety of workplaces common to local governments. In-person or a virtual walkthrough of your facilities is available upon contacting PERMA. Our programs also include assistance for those working at home to develop ergonomic best practices. These are just a few examples of how seriously we have focused our efforts over the past year to help municipalities in New York State. Another important issue we are following is the growing difficulty for New York self-insured counties to place excess insurance coverage due to the rising related cost of the COVID pandemic. As a result, PERMA is working on an alternative, more affordable in-house option for counties experiencing this financial hardship. Stay tuned as our efforts in this area progress. We will be sure to keep our partners at NYSAC informed. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you, and thank you for supporting NYSAC by attending this virtual conference. I wish you all a good conference.
Thanks again to PERMA. We work closely with PERMA, and they take our lead on a lot of things that impact counties. So it's an important relationship, and it's designed to help counties deal with our workers' compensation issues. Now back to our speakers. The first speaker will be Jeffrey Weiss. He's an adjunct professor and senior fellow at New York Law School, where he directs the New York Census and Redistricting Institute. He is now working on his 5th redistricting cycle. In past years, he served as redistricting counsel to 5 state assembly speakers and 4 state Senate Democratic leaders. He currently serves as counsel to Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez, the Assembly's Lat 4 chair, and he is the co-editor author of the National Conference of State Legislatures' recently published 2020 Redistricting Red Book, a comprehensive handbook on the census and redistricting processes. He also served as counsel to the last 2 New York City Council redistricting commissions and to numerous state and local governments across New York and the nation. Our second speaker is Gerald Benjamin, Dr. Gerald Benjamin. In 2008, Dr. Benjamin founded the Center for Research, Regional Engagement and Outreach, or CREO, at SUNY New Paltz and was appointed the Associate Vice President for Regional Engagement and the Director of CREO at that time. In 2015, the center was renamed after Gerald and is now known as the Benjamin Center for Public Policy Initiatives at SUNY New Paltz. He became a distinguished professor, the university's highest rank by action of the SUNY Board of Trustees in 2002. Dr. Benjamin is a Fulbright scholar, previously served as chair of the Department of Public Science, Political Science, and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at SUNY New Paltz. He has written and commented extensively on state and local government and regional governance with a special emphasis on New York. He was formerly the director of the Center for the New York State and Local Government Studies at Rockefeller Institute of Government, served as research director of the Temporary State Commission on Constitutional Revision that was appointed by Governor Mario Cuomo, was principal research advisor to the New York City Charter Revision Commission, and served as Ulster County's legislative chair and headed the commission that produced and won adoption of the Ulster County Charter. Dr. Benjamin knows our counties well. He has spoken several times to NYSAC audiences, and we are pleased to have Dr. Benjamin and Jeffrey Weiss with us this morning. I would like to turn it over to Jeff Weiss now. Thank you.
Redistricting process. I might have just been muted, so I'll just reintroduce myself by saying good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone. I will be providing an overview of the New York State redistricting process, quite a new one from what you've seen in past decades. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of what's happening in New York, I'll just mention that we've had the most unprecedented federal decennial census, if not in my lifetime, in decades. We had a situation where the Census Bureau was faced with a shutdown due to the pandemic and delayed the census taking operations, which should have ended in July, and stretched it out to October. Because of that, the post-enumeration counting process will also take longer. The federal statutes require two things on deadlines. First is that the Census Bureau report the total number of people in each state, plus the congressional reapportionment, the number of congressional districts to which each state is entitled by December 31st, and that date has passed. The next deadline is that states are to receive their granular block data, known as PL 94-171 data, for which to use for redistricting, and that is due to the states by April 1st, but also because of the pandemic, that is being pushed to September 30th. Congress will be asked by legislation to extend both of those dates, but it's in the books now that we're not going to see redistricting data by age, race, and ethnicity delivered to the states until September 30th. All 50 states will receive their data at the same time, and New York State will get the data. The set will be delivered electronically to the governor, to the 4 legislative leaders and their designees, and then the following day, on or about October 1st, if not the same day, September 30th, online, so that the data could be downloaded and used with the appropriate software to begin drawing lines, literally. The other busy activity we've seen with the census is the question of counting non-citizens. I think everyone knows by now that the Trump effort to add a citizenship question was thwarted, reaching the U.S. Supreme Court nearly 2 years ago. After that, then President Trump sought to exclude undocumented immigrants, or as he called them, illegal aliens, from the population counts used to apportion congressional districts. That was challenged in several courts. The Supreme Court heard an appeal, but said it's too early yet because we don't even know if the Census Bureau can complete its process in time for, number 1, December 31st deadlines, number 2, whether they could even find the number of non-citizens because it wasn't asked in the census, and the Census Bureau admitted it had no real ability to collect administrative data to determine who's legal and who's not. Late last week, the Justice Department in Washington sent the Census Bureau a letter stating that it does not need better citizenship information to administer and enforce the Voting Rights Act. The pretext used by former Commerce Secretary in the Trump administration to create a lot of this census confusion and really hurt the count from my perspective. Also, very important for all of you to notice, the delay in delivering the data till September 30th might have an impact on your own county's redistricting process. Each county is different. Some counties have deadlines or start dates tied to the delivery of census data. Others have calendar start dates. But just be aware that there is now a spring primary where the petitioning process begins in February 2023. And you need to check your county charter or county redistricting rules to see what your final deadline is to pass a plan. New York City had a charter amendment passed last year, or 2 years ago actually, that moved up the process so that the redistricting of the New York City Council would be completed by December 31st or so in 2022, rather than in February, March of 2023, as the law currently states, because of the spring primary. Now we'll start on the state process. I mentioned to you reapportionment, which is, can we go back, please, to the first slide? Yes, other way. Can you back up 2 slides? Okay, let's stay there for a second. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we know that reapportionment, the reallocation of congressional districts among the states, will take place April 30th. Then we'll know if New York loses 1 district or 2 districts. The redistricting data, and redistricting is the actual line drawing within a state or within a county or a city of local legislative or state legislative boundaries and congressional district boundaries. That data arrives September 30th. Right now, New York has 27 congressional districts of 717,000 people each. We have 63 Senate districts of approximately 310,000 people, and then state assembly districts, of which there are 150, with about 130,000 people in each district. Congressional districts must be of equal population. They differ among the 27 districts by literally 1 or 2 or maybe a handful of people. State Senate, state assembly, county legislative, other local government districts can vary up to a 10% bubble from the size of the smallest to the largest district. Next slide. Okay, so 3 basic rules govern redistricting at the state level. We have the U.S. Constitution's 1 person, 1 vote requirement, that 1 person's vote equals another person's vote. Basically, districts be of equally populous numbers. We have the Federal Voting Rights Act, which kicks in where we have significant levels of racially polarized voting, which prohibits the minority community voters from electing their preferred candidates of choice. We have the New York State Constitution, which was amended by the voters in 2014 to create a new commission, which I'll be discussing momentarily. And of course, at the county level, as Professor Benjamin will discuss, we have county charters. Next slide. Okay, so the basic tools, I mentioned PL 94-171 block data. That is the granular data by age, race, and ethnicity that are the building blocks of drawing districts. That data is fed into high-speed software, of which there are a handful of commercially available vendors that can provide it for you. And then who draws the lines? Well, at the state legislative level, traditionally led for the Legislative Advisory Task Force on Reapportionment and Demographic Research has drawn the plans for the legislature. But now we have a new commission, and the commission is what I'll be spending the rest of my time talking about. Next slide. Okay, so the new constitutional amendment that voters approved in 2014 creates a commission. It's called the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission, but it's independent in name only. The commission reports to the state legislature. A state court judge back in 2013 or so even ruled that on the ballot question, the commission may be called independent by title, but in practice it's advisory. But the commission has to work with a handful of basic criteria: population equality, Voting Rights Act compliance. Those are federal requirements. State requirements also include compactness, that districts be somewhat square, rectangular, of regular shape, not have 55 or 100 jagged edges to it. Contiguity, that you can go from Part A of a district to Part B of a district and never leave the district or get your feet wet. Keeping communities of interest intact, and communities of interest are self-defined but are basically socioeconomic interests or hospital areas, medical communities, school communities, a number of things that you could define by what you think your community is made up of. The state constitution also talks about following jurisdictional boundaries: towns, cities, villages. It also considers incumbency, not pairing incumbents into the same district, and also partisan fairness, that districts not be drawn to advantage or disadvantage either one of the political parties. Next slide. Okay, so we have an independent, well, the independent commission has 10 members. 8 of them are appointed by the state legislative leaders. So you see here on the PowerPoint that Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie has appointed Elaine Frazier, a longtime Albany state government employee and activist, Eugene Benger, an attorney based at the Manhattan law firm Debevoise and Plimpton. Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins has appointed Dr. John Flateau. who was a longtime redistricting activist going back at least till 1980, and David Imamura, who is also a lawyer at Debevoise and Plimpton, but not connected in any way to Councilor Benger. Next slide. And on the Republican side, the two Republican leaders have made their appointments. Senator George Winter, who served 32 years in Albany in the legislature, and Jack Martins, a former state senator from Nassau County. And on the Assembly side, Will Barkley has appointed Charlie Nesbitt, himself a former Assembly minority leader, and Keith Wofford, who was the GOP standard bearer for Attorney General in 2018. Next slide. And then the 8 independent members then selected 2 members who were not affiliated with either of the 2 major political parties. Dr. Ivelisse Cuevas Molina from Fordham University and Ross Brady from Brooklyn, administrator at the Union Temple in that borough. So we have 10 members. As things have worked out so far, the Dr. Cuevas Molina has more or less sided with Democrats, and Ross Brady has more or less sided with Republicans, but they are considered independent. Next slide. Okay, so how will this new process work? The commission that is now created must undertake a robust outreach effort to engage the public, and the commissioners are trying to develop methodologies now to reach out to people. I'll get into what their difficulties are in the next slide or two. The commission must follow special criteria that I outlined a slide or two back. And then I've outlined here the process in terms of procedures, and I highlighted in red the importance to know that the commission can submit up to 2 sets of plans to the state legislature for congressional, state senate, and assembly districts. The legislature can accept the maps on the first round, reject them, or develop plans of its own after the first set of plans are either rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor. Then the commission goes back for a second round, and a second set of plans can be accepted or rejected by the legislature, accepted or vetoed by the governor, and if accepted, in either the first set of plans or if the second set of plans are accepted, and signed by the governor, they become law. However, on the third round, the governor, I'm sorry, the legislature can draw whatever plan it wants, also subject to a gubernatorial veto. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of the commissions and where it stands now, the commissioners are supposed to select 1 member to serve as chair. They're deadlocked so far. We have a situation where the Democrats recommended or nominated one of their own members to be chair, and the Republicans did the same, and they split 5-5. The only vote they've taken so far with a recorded vote, we see that 5-5 with no odd member or 11th member to break a tie, could mean means deadlock. The legislature also appropriated $1 million for the commission to operate through March 31st of this year, and more funds can be appropriated for next year in the state budget. But the commission, as of today, has not received a single penny to operate. The situation has developed that last year the legislature put the $1 million in the Department of State budget as part of the Aid to Localities bill. And the Department of State and the executive branch has maintained that they needed a lot of time to figure out how to fund the commission. So it was decided by the Department of State, or the Division of the Budget, that the funds will be distributed to the commission via the SUNY Foundation, which is a separate not-for-profit organization that operates to support the SUNY system, and that the SUNY Foundation would basically administer and fund or oversee the work of the commission. Well, 2 weeks ago, the commission met, and they meet through the courtesy of the state Senate's website ability, and they decided they are not going to have any part of this contract between the Department of State and the SUNY Foundation. thus no funding, no ability to pay the two co-executive directors that they've designated to be hired, Karen Blatt, who comes from the Assembly Democratic side, and Doug Brakel, who comes from the Republican Senate minority side. They can't get paid yet. They can't buy paper clips, do outreach, open an email account, or anything else. The commission is making an attempt to go back to the legislature to try to include this funding as well as additional funding in the one House budgets that the Assembly and Senate will take up at some point in the near future. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned on the timeline, the Census Bureau data arrived September 30th. This means that the commission will have only 3 months to develop their plans for the legislature and the Congress, down from the 9 months that had been planned and envisioned by the state constitutional amendment in 2014. Before these plans could be approved, at least the first set of plans, the commission must hold 12 hearings throughout the state. Those 12 hearings are designated specifically by county. Each of the 5 counties in New York, plus Erie, Onondaga, Monroe, Nassau, Suffolk, I think Westchester, maybe 1 or 2 others. Now, the commission must also make its first draft plans public by September 15th or soon after, as is possible. Obviously, they're not going to be able to meet their September 15th deadline, and if the data arrives September 30th, my guess would be, based on experience, they could have a plan as early as sometime late October, more likely November, but all of their work has to more or less wrap up by the end of the year. So the commission will develop, debate, and agree to plans before they can be sent to the legislature. An open question is, given the 5-5 nature of this commission, whether they will even agree to plans, but that's not for me to guess at this point. We'll see what happens as the whole process unfolds. Next slide. Okay, so also it's important to note that the commission's voting system was designed to assure that the minority party's voice is taken into consideration. To do that, of the 7 members in the commission, 7 must approve a proposed district map before it can be sent to the legislature. And of those 7, at least 1 appointee from each of the 4 legislative leaders, meaning between the lines, 1 Assembly and 1 Senate Republican appointee needs to be on the side of the 7 votes. If the legislature is under divided political control, as it is not right now, then of those 7 votes, you have to have 1 by the Speaker and 1 by the Senate temporary president, meaning that, as it was envisioned, you'd have a Democratic Assembly, Republican-led Senate, and they had to agree bipartisanly to a plan. But that's not the case now. Democrats control both chambers. Under the current law, the commission has to submit a plan or plans with the greatest number of votes to the legislature, but this is all subject to change given a pending constitutional amendment that voters will be considering in November. Next slide. Okay, so the commission right now has to submit its first set of plans to the legislature by January 1st, 2022, and is given an extension, a waiver, no reasons for it. They just have until January 15th. A pending constitutional amendment that voters will consider this November will set the first plan set deadline to January 1st. And in considering these bills, the legislature has the option to take up Congress and the legislature in the same bill. Traditionally, they've been taken up as separate bills, with the Assembly and the Senate being in one plan, but it's an option that the Constitution now allows. As I mentioned, the legislature can approve the first proposed set of plans without amendments and send it to the governor to approve or veto. Next slide. And then if the legislature, as I mentioned, rejects the first plan, or if the governor vetoes it, then the commission must submit a second plan to the legislature by February 28th, 2022. And as I mentioned, that cuts into the new spring primary filing period, qualifying period to run. So the pending constitutional amendment would change the deadline for the second plan to January 15th. And if the second plan is either rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor, then the legislature can amend the second plan as it deems necessary. I put that in green because those 4 words could mean a lot. And what that might mean, we'll find out later, but the legislature can do as it deems necessary. As I mentioned, gubernatorial votes of the first or second plans can be overridden. Same with the third plan. And while the legislature must follow the same criteria as the commission, if it draws a plan on its own, the legislature has more leeway to make accommodations. And I also mentioned that no New York governor has vetoed a redistricting plan since Franklin Roosevelt back in, I think it was 1931. Next slide. As I mentioned again, a plan developed by and agreed to by the Assembly and Senate is subject to a gubernatorial veto. In the Constitution as it stands now, different Assembly and Senate vote requirements apply depending on party control. As we have now, if one party controls both chambers, then at least 2/3 of the members of each chamber must approve a commission plan. The Assembly and Senate are now both 2/3 Democratic majority, so they should be able to have the votes to pass a plan, so if they so choose. There's also a provision in the Constitution that if the chambers have divided partisan control, then you need to have a simple majority of each chamber. And again, these provisions also would be changed by the pending constitutional amendment. Next slide. I'm hoping to wrap up soon. The amendment also provides simply if someone wants to challenge a plan in state court, they go file in before any state Supreme Court justice in any of the state's counties. If a judge finds the plan to violate any part of the law, it goes back to the legislature, not to the commission, to remedy. And any appeal from a state court decision could be appealable to the appellate division, and then finally with the state court of appeals. And of course, the state constitution is silent on challenges that can be filed in federal court, of course, which they can. Next slide. Okay, one piece of unfinished business. In 2010, the state legislature, Governor David Paterson, approved a law that reallocates the state's prison populations to their places of residence prior to incarceration. After 2010, about 30,000 state prisoners were reallocated from their prison locations where they had been counted and used for redistricting numbers, and then they were reallocated to their census blocks of their homes of record prior to incarceration. This provision was left out of the state constitutional amendment that will be before the voters this year, it was left out of the 2014 amendment, but will be included in the amendment that voters will be considering in November of this year. Next slide. So the amendment, really quickly, changes a lot of the rules. It would require any 7 commissioners to approve map drafts to send to the legislature. It sets a January 1st deadline for 2022 for the commission's first plan, and January 15th, 2022 for the commission's second plan if it's needed. To approve a commission plan, all you'd need in the legislature, Assembly, and Senate would be a simple majority in each chamber. And if the commission itself fails to develop a plan, then 60% of the membership of the Assembly and Senate each would be required to develop a plan of the Assembly or Senate's own drawing. The Senate would be set at 63 districts. If you might recall, in each of the last 3 or 4 decades, the Senate was increased in size by about 1 district each of the last few decades. The amendment would eliminate the partisan co-executive directors, which are in place now, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and it would also, as the previous slide indicated, end the prison gerrymandering statutes that practice that keeps prisoners at their homes, at their prison locations, rather than reallocate them to their homes before incarceration. Well, I think the last slide, if you want to contact me, there's my email address. So thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Jeff. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Gerald Benjamin. Before I do, I just want to remind our attendees that we will take up questions after Dr. Benjamin makes his presentation. To ask a question, please submit it in the questions panel on your dashboard. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Jerry Benjamin. I may know a lot of you, but I can't see you, so I can't tell. I'm pleased to be involved with NYSEC again. I was on the NYSEC board back in the day when I was in county government, and it's an extraordinarily important organization for counties and for New York State, so I'm happy to help. Can we see my first slide? I'm going to run through the early slides fast because they're background, just so to contextualize what I'm going to say about counties. You know that federal and state law require decennial redistricting to ensure fair representation in Congress, state legislature. Please go back. In fact, state legislatures were created, county legislations were created in connection with the one man, one vote decision and its aftermath. So we have to comply with rules and regulations and requirements that in fact are in a dynamic relation with the very existence of county legislatures, was kind of historically interesting. Next slide, please. There are 57 counties outside New York City. New York City, of course, has to be in conformance with one man, one vote as well, one person, one vote as well, but we excluded from this analysis because it's a unique jurisdiction. 17 counties are governed by boards of supervisors, the classic structure that dates to the late 19th or to the 19th century, and one that has some very important strengths. But they do not have legislatures. 40 counties have legislatures. Boards of supervisors, as we heard, do not do redistricting. They must adjust their weighted voting systems or their multi-member systems combined with weighted voting or some other accommodation or adjustment they made to comply with one person, one vote. Decennially, 40 counties have legislatures, almost considering if redistricting is needed and if redistricting is necessary. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, when you do weighted voting, as I'm sure those from those counties that have weighted voting know, we are not doing simple proportionality to population in the weights, but we're doing weighting in accord with voting power and something called the Banzhaf index, which I will talk more about if there are questions about it, but for efficiency reasons, going to move on to talking about redistricting and to stick with the focus of this presentation. Next slide, please. In legislatures, 23 county legislatures have charters and 17 don't have charters, and those with charters may proceed distinctly from those that don't have charters. Many counties that have charters preempt state law reprocess and relative to the process and criteria under constitutional home rule. Constitutional home rule is a big question and a different topic, and I'm happy to stultify you with an analysis of constitutional rule in another occasion. But we do have a decision in Westchester dating to the early 90s that establishes that counties are preemptive of the state if they have charters and if they provide for a process of redistricting in their charters. Now, in counties that don't have charters, they operate under state law. It turns out, as you'll see, that state law doesn't specify process for redistricting, but specifies criteria. And so you can have a commission, for example, in a county without a charter if by local law the county determines that it wishes to have one, but you don't have to have one. An interesting question again is if you're operating under state law, can you preempt the state law with a local law? And I think you probably can, but it's not established law. Next slide, please. Niagara County added local criteria, even though it did not have a charter, to its redistricting process. Now we'll look at we'll come back to this, but you have to, the brief point is you have to comply with federal criteria, state criteria if you don't have a charter, criteria in the charter if you do, and you can add local criteria as well. So we'll come back to this slide. Probably put it in the wrong place, I'm afraid to say. Move on, let's move on. So there are federal requirements. Next slide, please. That's the famous drawing of the 19th century drawing of the gerrymander. I say gerrymander, everybody else says gerrymander. Since my name is Jerry, I prefer to call it gerrymander. It's named after Elbridge Gerry. I'm going to give this idea up because I've lost, over the 50 years I've been teaching, any influence on how this is pronounced. So it's simply, this practice is designing legislative districts to gain political advantage on a partisan basis, geographic basis, incumbent basis, racial or ethnic basis, so on. Designing to get your desired outcome. Next slide. The U.S. Supreme Court and the Congress have barred some but not all kinds of gerrymandering. You can't deny equal voting power to citizens. You must conform to one person, one vote, established in 1964. Racial and ethnic bias, denial of effective voice to persons and protected minorities. You can't do that under federal law, the Voting Rights Act mentioned already. But after lots of litigation, the Supreme Court refused to prevent designing districts for partisan advantage, calling this a political question. You can see that the decision was made very recently in 2019. So we still have partisan gerrymandering under federal standards, not prohibited. And that's the reason we have this alleged reform system that Jeff described in New York State that in fact was tortuously designed and probably wouldn't have worked effectively and is now being dismembered. So these are the decisions establishing one person, one vote and extended to counties in the 60s. Move on, please. Next slide. Try to go fast so there's time for you to ask some questions. Federal Voting Rights Act was first passed in 65 and renewed most recently for 25 years in 2006. It was designed to outlaw discrimination in voting procedures. And there I give you a quotation. It prohibits any voting qualification or prerequisite to voting on a standard or practice or procedure to deny or abridge the right of any citizen to vote on account of race or color. And we had litigation in New York on a number of jurisdictions based on Voting Rights Act claims. Niagara County, an example in 2011. I like to give an upstate example of this because there's a predisposition to see this as a downstate concern, but of course there are significant sized racial and ethnic minorities in upstate New York in many counties. And so we have to give consideration to the Voting Rights Act because of these citizens' absolute right to be heard effectively. Next slide, please. Shelby County, Holber, very famous case. It's called pre-clearance process to block discrimination by structural change in the way in voting procedures before they are implemented. Pre-clearance applied to certain defined counties. I was involved in the creation of the current New York City charter in the 80s. New York City was a pre-clearance jurisdiction because it met the criteria for low participation by minority members and voting patterns by minority members that were consistently showed that they were denied effective choice. New York City's changes had to be pre-cleared, and we had to pre-clear the charter changes. But this practice was eliminated by a decision of the Supreme Court in Shelby against Holder in 2013. Because states were essentially differently treated and were being discriminated against, the court said, based on past practice that was no longer in place, there followed lots of steps by states to change voting procedures, and we've seen the big fights nationally about access to the ballot and state laws, conflict about state laws having to do with voting, because of course this affects who wins and who loses in many important elections. Next slide. State requirements. So you have nested requirements, federal requirements, state requirements. The Municipal Home Rule Law sets out provisions for apportionment that apply to local government and counties among them. Counties are empowered to apportion their legislative bodies. Process for doing this not specified, as I suggested. Standards set out in priority order. Equal weight for the population of the local government, keeping towns intact if possible, representation areas in the same town or city, that is districts. The term districts is not used. The variance around the mean has to be within 5% in either direction, which is essentially adopting in state law a federal standard, establishing the courts. Providing substantially fair and effective representation, also language drawn from federal legislation. Convenient and contiguous territory in compact a form as practicable, and also allows mayors of cities and villages, supervisors of local boards, eligibility to serve as members of county legislative bodies. So it addresses the dual office holding question that sometimes comes up in county and local government in New York. I want to emphasize the point of priority order here. When you're making a map, each value that you implement constrains your capacity to implement the following values. So the order in which you do things is very important. That's been our experience of our mapping expert at the Benjamin Center, Josh Simons, as we've drawn maps for some jurisdictions, counties and cities in New York. Next slide, please. Now, there's a State Voting Rights Act under consideration in the legislature that has a significant chance of passing. The undoing of pre-clearance at the national level has led to a movement in some states to establish pre-clearance at the state level. And this act, if it passes, bars enactment of policy, practice, or procedure that in the totality of circumstances diminishes the ability of a member of a protected class, that is, certain language minorities, certain racial minorities, to make an effective choice. And what suggests that this capacity to make an effective choice is denied? If the election is uniquely timed or there's a low turnout produced, there may be a presumption of a violation. Certain structures are suspect, as has been the case, long the case under law, at-large election being one of them. The whole question of at-large elections use in New York is a big and open one, and it's being challenged in certain school districts, for example, in the Hudson Valley. So that's something to watch generally in local government. Racial polarization, election patterns are suspect, pre-clearance is instituted in the state law, and the statewide database would be developed and administered at SUNY. So the funding point is, this is not law yet, but as we know, as we heard, we're going to redistrict locally for the 2023 election. We're going to have a little less time, but it's going to be far less of a push than at the state level. And these rules may be in place by the time we do that. Next slide, please. Local processes. Now, we're assembling a systematic and comprehensive list of local processes, and that's not done yet. I focus mostly on, with my assistant, mostly on counties with charters, more easily accessible than the ones with local laws. So this is not a comprehensive list, and I did the data assembly myself. Now that I'm retired, I have more time. So mistakes here are my fault, and if I've got it wrong and you're from a county where I got it wrong, I'd be very grateful if you point it out. I don't think I got a lot of errors here, but I may have some because I was trying to meet the deadlines for this presentation. And because my assistants are much better at assembling data than I am systematically. So in one case, in all cases, except if the charter otherwise provides, the legislature is responsible for redistricting. In some cases, the legislature in its charter has very little detail on how to do this. Sullivan County is silent. often, in Sullivan, I believe is the case, the charter boundaries are indicated in the district boundaries are indicated in the charter specifically, so the charter has to be amended, and the amending process for the charter has to be followed to change the districts. In Rensselaer County, the charter specifies the legislative responsibility and references relevant provisions of state law. So it says, county legislature, you do it, and follow the state law, the municipal law that I previously cited. You talk where the charter specifies legislative responsibility, but only minimally details the process. Requires a bipartisan commission within 6 months of, I think, I didn't specify here, but 6 months of the start of the year ending in 1, and within 3 months must provide a plan. So there's one model, legislative responsibility, little guidance in local charter. Talking about charter counties now, I mentioned briefly a couple of non-charter counties, and we can go back to that. Excuse me. Next slide, please. A reform commission with final authority. This is where the charter, which there's a degree of confusion about this in counties that I noticed, not everywhere, but in some places. The charter essentially creates the legislature, like the state constitution creates the state legislature. So the charter can take a function that would ordinarily done by the legislature and give it to somebody else, and that, in this case, a commission, and say there's going to be a charter commission. Here's how it's going to be constituted. Here's how it's going to work. Here's what it's going to consider. And when it's done, its work is going to be final. This is the most radical, I don't mean to say radical in a kind of liberal conservative way, but the biggest change, which essentially takes out of the hands of the interested parties the definition of their districts and puts it in the hands of other people. Now, you can't make redistricting apolitical, but you can distance it from the people who most immediately benefit or are disadvantaged. So if you look at Ulster County and most recently Dutchess County, there's a process for assembling a pool of potential commissioners to do this. Certain people are barred from service on their current job, their relationships with people in the current job, or their partisan links. There are multiple appointing authorities to keep one person from controlling all the members. There are processes to force action so delay doesn't kill the process. In Ulster, there's a process for no single person functioning as chair if the commission determines it wants to do that. First convening and deadlines are specified. Detailed nested local standards are added to the federal and state standards, and this, Jeffrey mentioned what some of these might be. But remember, when you add standards at every step of the way, you're limiting following options. So communities of interest. In one city we worked in, there was a neighborhood that was defined very clearly, and that had institutions and even a community center. And sundering that neighborhood would have been offensive to the people who live there. So we retained that neighborhood intact in the districting process, in the outcome we proposed to the commission. Provisions for support, very important that the counties provide money and people to help do the work. Transparency, public hearings, doing the work in public. I was involved in creating this provision in Ulster, and I was really impressed the first time it was done by the degree to which it was done in public. And ultimately, the commissioners got used to it and had very frank conversations about lines with journalists and citizens in the room. Commission action is final. Most recently adopted a process like this. Suffolk has a process that approaches this, but is, as I'll explain, not quite there. The fundamental question is, does the commission file a result, and is that result final? Next slide, please. The charter requires an advisory commission but the legislature must act. Now, the size of this print is so small that I can barely see it, so you can probably see it. So your slides will be available to you and you can blow them up. But essentially the point is the commissioner has a responsibility but decides to create an advisory group. The group could include legislators or not. It could include county officials or not. It could include partisans. In some counties in central New York, for example, Board of Election commissioners are on the Redistricting Commission. Now, these are partisans. They're chosen by the Republican Democratic Party. The department is very interested in this because it affects their capacity to administer elections and might constrain or make harder administration of elections if election districts are moved from one legislative district to another. It changes ballot preparation, it changes the location of voting, and it's very challenging. Nonetheless, they're partisans. Usually when the advisory commission is used, the majority party retains a majority in the advisory commission. Size differs from 5 members to 11 members. There are interesting detailed variations in how the commission is constituted and the degree to which it's independent. Commissions, it's hard to argue that a commission is independent if majority party controls more members and is of course an entity at interest. In Tompkins County, the commission is directed to behave in a nonpartisan and independent manner, notwithstanding how the members are appointed. And local culture is very important in this. In Clinton County, I read that in the last decade, 3 people were principal in making recommendations to the legislature. 2 legislators on a committee overseeing the process, and the county planner. Well, apparently worked well according to the press, and the culture of communities differ. Some places are far more partisan. I dare say that Erie County is a more partisan place than Clinton County, so the local culture matters. In Erie County, I think I have right that the county executive appoints the 11th member of the commission who cannot vote on the outcome of the deliberation of the body, so it requires at least 1 Republican to join with the Democrats or 1 Democrat to join with the Republicans. Produce a majority on the 11-person commission. Resources have to be provided, transparency, deadline, but the legislature must act to adopt the result, or in some cases, the legislature must act or can act to challenge the result timely through, since the result is being affected by a local law, through a permissive referendum as provided in state law, or through a process that might be specified in the charter. Next slide. So here I summarize. A commission, county charter commission, not required by the charter, 1 appointing authority, full discretion with the appointing authorities read the appointees, legislators on the commission, major parties represented. I'd say is a less independent commission. A more independent commission is one that's required by the charter, has multiple appointing authorities, processes for selecting qualified appointees, that is for creating a pool and selecting from the pool. As named group representatives, there are some cases where I believe in Suffolk County where groups advocating for minorities or for good government are given a place on the commission. Legislators may not serve because their parties and interests, and party officials may not serve. So this is the range of choice for creation of county commission. Why create the commission? Well, it might help generate public support because of the perception of independence, even though independence is not full. It might create a degree of independence. We can't be entirely cynical about this. It certainly suggests that the legislators are sensitive to public concern about legislators who pick their constituents rather than constituents who pick their legislators. One of the big concerns across the country is unfairness in design of districts and the consequent bias in the outcomes of in the partisan outcomes of elections, expressed by Republican and Democratic presidents over the years and a host of others. One of the big reform objectives, but mostly in New York, in charter and non-charter counties, the dominant party in the legislature controls the process. And many people are committed to that who are active in county government. It's not an unsupported process, although it's largely regarded as a major target of reform in American government. Next slide, please. When is an advisory committee, charter commission truly independent? Are there criteria in the law beyond state and federal criteria? Is there majority party control? Is there a contingent provision for failure to act as a way of getting a result if the commission deadlocks? Those are less independent. I indicate these are my opinions, ladies and gentlemen, so understand that I'm happy to discuss them. More independent, we see the list. I want to leave some time for you to ask me things. Next slide, please. Here we are at the question period, and there's still time to ask questions. So please type your questions in the questions tab on your webinar dashboard, and we'll try to answer them as they arise. Thank you for your attention. I can be reached at the Benjamin Center if you want to reach me, and I'll make sure that when we distribute these slides, my telephone number, which is no longer at the university, and my email address are available to you. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Benjamin, I thank you very much for your time. The last slide, you said these are my opinions, but I will say these are the opinions of a researcher and a scholar and a former county official who has a lot of experience and expertise in this issue. So I appreciate that very much. This is a good opportunity for any of our attendees to ask a question of these two experts on redistricting. Okay, well, I have one. I will start off the question and answer period. Jeff, in terms of the state commission, the issue with funding the commission is really determining whether the commission can do its work. How do you think that the legislature or the governor breaks this impasse we currently have?
Am I muted now?
You're fine now, Jeff.
Okay. Well, just to repeat quickly, we're going to find out whether the commission will receive funding by what the Assembly and Senate do between now and April 1st. There's a high probability that both the Assembly and Senate will include additional funding and possibly redirected funding in the one House budgets that they'll be taking up, so they can sit down with the governor and negotiate out how the commission will be able to operate. I think it's to everyone's advantage that the commission at least be given the chance, the opportunity to get its work done, since the governor especially worked so hard to create this commission back in 2012 when his staff and the Senate Republican leadership essentially drafted the language for the amendment. We're probably not going to see much out of the legislature because they would not be assuming control of the process until at least January 1st, when we'll know whether the commission is even able to develop plans to send to the legislature for consideration and approval. So we still have a good 10 months ahead of us, but I'll say that once the commission is up and funded, once they have an email address and an outreach operation, they'll have a very tight time frame in which to get their job done between October 1st and December 31st of this year.
Great, thank you. And I have some other questions on that I may follow up with you and directly on that, Jeff. We have two questions in. Yes, Dr. Benjamin.
If I may, Just a little political speculation. We now see the governor and the legislature at each other's throats. And we have a history of a governor taking hands off on redistricting because it's life and death for legislative members and majorities. We see that the governor has a veto on the plans. This is intriguing. What happens if these questions of sanctioning the governor, reducing his emergency powers, even impeaching him, persist into the period where redistricting occurs?
Yeah, I'll just add to that Governor Andrew Cuomo threatened to veto the 2012 Assembly and Senate redistricting plans unless he got an agreement to create a commission moving forward. Well, he got that commission agreement. We've got the commission now before us. But in my past 4 decades, every governor that I've seen, Kerry, Cuomo, Pataki, Andrew Cuomo, have all threatened a veto, but none of them have. Franklin Roosevelt and Al Smith were the last 2 governors to veto plans.
Well, the two of you have certainly added a fair amount of intrigue to the political environment that we have right now. So thank you for that. We have 2 questions on prison gerrymandering, and this is especially important for upstate, several upstate communities. Where are we at with the prisoner reallocation?
Well, at this point, I can tell you that the LATFOR, the Legislative Advisory Task Force and Reapportionment staff, has been working on reallocating the prison populations. In 2011 and 12, after the LATFOR staff completed the prisoner reallocation effort, where about 30,000 prisoners were successfully reallocated to their homes of record prior to incarceration, that data was made available to counties. And from my recollection, most counties, for their county legislative or city councilmanic redistrictings, used the adjusted data that reallocated the prison populations. The 2010 law is still in the books, and I recall it does require localities to also reallocate prison populations.
So just to follow up on that, it's the choice of the locality then, Jeff?
I've got to double check the 2010 law, and I'll do that, Mark, and I'll let you know. But as I recall, the law, it's Chapter XX of the budget enacted in 2010. It did require counties to also use the reallocated adjusted data for their own county redistricting efforts. I know I did work specifically in New York City and Nassau County where we did use the adjusted data.
Okay, thank you. This is from a county official, how do we in a county obtain your, I would say this is either the Benjamin Center's or Jeff's analysis on our own county regarding our redistricting procedures?
Contact both of us. We hope to be working together, but Jerry and I think we're glad to talk with you.
Let me say a couple of things about that. This may be, I don't mean offensive, but something to think about. In the last round, and in some cities, we encountered cases where the local staff was made very uncomfortable because there was close partisan division in the government, and they were being asked, the planning department was being asked to do something that would get somebody or other mad at them and would bring pressure on them. So there were occasions where we were brought in because we weren't, even if there was local expertise, where we weren't local. And that just wasn't to blame us, it was to keep a certain working relationship among the politicians and the professional staff working for the county comfortable and productive. So that's, in some places, as I read about Clinton County, it seemed to be no problem at all. So it's something to think about that's related to your question, Mark. Second point is, of course, we'll make our address and email access available, and we have done districting under consulting contracts. We have done analysis of districting to talk about it. There are lots of alternatives to the ones that as you might imagine, with so many choices to be made, alternative to the ones that may initially be reached. And we're capable of making analytic assessments and reporting on choices that might have been made and alternative choices that might be available, in addition to doing the work itself.
Yeah, I'll just also add, the New York Law School Census and Redistricting Institute and the Benjamin Center were both created to be helpful. I particularly from a nonpartisan, objective basis, and I try to come in. I'll say this as sometimes an outsider, although I am a bona fide New Yorker, that I will provide to the best of my ability objective legal advice that if you want to avoid going to court, if you want to avoid a county executive veto or what have you, if you want to be successful in creating a plan, whether it's a partisan plan or not, a highly partisan plan or not, there's a way to do it. And there's a way not to be greedy. There's a way not to overreach, and there's a way to do this in the public's best interest. And I've been, I tend to think that I've been quite successful at that approach across the country.
Okay, thank you.
The one thing we've seen, though, nationally in the last 10 years is overreaching by aggressive partisan legislators. And I think everyone should be on notice that we'll probably see more challenges based on more public awareness and more public involvement with redistricting than we have in any previous decade.
Thank you. And moving on, and we have a few more questions we'd like to get to here. First of all, is there any place that our counties, or the people on the phone can go, or people on the webinar can go, to get a simple but comprehensive publication to guide non-charter counties as they examine the redistricting process? And we're interested in that too. NISAC would like to make that available to our members if there is one.
Well, we're working on a document like that at New York Law School. I'm sure I can collaborate with Jerry on that. Also, I will make available, it's not on counties specifically, but I am the co-author, co-editor of the National Conference of State Legislatures Redistricting Red Book. It's a handbook that about 2 inches thick that goes through the entire legal and procedural overview of redistricting. It doesn't tell you in a county specifically how to redistrict, but it's a great overall handbook on the process. And Mark, I'll send you a copy, and others who'd like one, please get in touch. They do charge $100 a copy for it, and I'd be glad to make an accommodation on a one basis.
That's great.
Mark,
Thank you.
I'd say look at the counties. Look at Montgomery County, which actually is a county that retained ultimate authority with the legislature, but very thoughtfully designed its procedures. And on its website, you can find documentation of its process and thinking. Look at Dutchess County and what they've recently done, which took a rather strong reform effort. Ulster County revised their process after having an initial experience. And the committee that did that created a record. So there isn't, it's our intention at the Benjamin Center to have a simple list. You can find the beginnings of that list of issues and concerns at the end of this slide presentation and say, here's things you should think about in the process. Here's things you should think about in the criteria, decisions you have to make about who's responsible and what each responsible party should do. So I agree with Jeff that that's needed. But there are some recent experiences. I think the Montgomery County process of establishing their charter took this particular issue very seriously and developed a strong record. And I will say that I had nothing to do with it, so it's not self-praise.
One thing that led to, I think, what we're both doing is that as Jerry and I are both practitioners across the state, if I was working, let's say, in Suffolk County, I wanted to know what was happening in Erie County. I had no one-stop shop, to go to. So we began collecting information on each county, town, and city process several years ago, collaborating first with SUNY Buffalo Law School, and began collecting all the different county processes, so that next year, the year after, if you're in Western New York, you want to find out what's happening similarly in the Hudson Valley, you'd have some place to find out without having to, call each county cold and waste time.
Well, thank you. We will please keep us informed about that, how you're doing on that process. Last question for Dr. Benjamin. Otsego County has a board of representatives with weighted voting similar to counties with boards of supervisors. Of the 14 districts, we have one district that has almost twice the weighted votes of the smallest district. It's possible that once census data is released, the district will have more than twice the weighted votes of the smallest district. Will the county be required by law to redistrict if this happens? It's a very specific question, Dr. Benjamin.
So that's interesting, because unlike the case in counties that have boards of supervisors based upon towns, the boundaries can be changed of the legislative districts. I think that you cannot have an outcome where one jurisdiction dominates the decision-making process to the exclusion, and so that there's no circumstance where one entity would have some influence in an outcome. I don't know. In other words, the formulas are power equalizing, not population equalizing in effect. So there are some circumstances under which you'd be precluded from having that outcome. I would have to study, and I'd be happy to look further into it if you want me to. I'd be curious about it, whether in this specific circumstance you'd have to be precluded from that outcome.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm being clear. Some outcomes would not be okay.
Yeah,
that
right.
It would be something I'd have to look at it more carefully.
I would just add, Nassau County had a situation in the 1990s where they had a board of supervisors with the weighted voting, and the town of Hempstead had the balance of power between the largest township and some of the smallest cities caused a federal court challenge, Jackson versus Board of Supervisors, that reorganized county government and resulted in a 19-member, single-member district county legislature.
Not quite the same as the example, but
Okay.
Well, you can't have one place, for example, that has 51% of the vote, because the other places would be irrelevant. So there's certain outcomes that that are not possible, but I'd have to look at that.
Okay. Well, we'll provide your contact information with the slides when we post them this afternoon. I thank you very much for your time, Jeff and Jerry, and Jeanette Stanziano, our Director of Education and Training at NYSAC, who made this technology all happen. And to all of our members who joined us today, thank you. We will be continuing our NYSAC 2021 Legislative Conference for the remainder of the week. We have 7 more webinar workshops. Check out our website for our lineup. We appreciate your time. And one more time, we'd like to thank PERMA for sponsoring this workshop. Enjoy your day.